Welcome back to Opening Statements. I'm Julia Janae. This morning, we are turning a spotlight on an appeal for a 24-year-old named Sydney Powell. She was convicted in the brutal stabbing of her mother. Powell was 19 years old when she flunked out of college, but kept it a secret from her family. When the truth came out, Sydney got into an argument with her mother, Brenda, and stabbed her over 20 times. Now, her defense attorney argued that this was a psychotic break. Here's Powell on body cam video as police tried to talk to her about what had happened.
Yeah, take her outside.
Come on. Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on. Come on, come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
I want my dad.
Huh?
I want my dad.
What happened? What's going on? What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. And I came back and she was on the ground.
Okay, you heard a bang.
There was a bang. Someone broken.
Powell was sentenced to at least 15 years in prison, 15 years to life, and now she's asking for a new trial. This case that was tinged with tragedy, a heartbroken family, and mental health concerns. So joining us to talk about this appeal is Powell's trial attorney, Dawn Milarczyk, and her appeal attorney, Daniel Eisenbry, is with us as well. Daniel, let me start with you. Thank you so much for joining us and letting us know. I know you've just been in front of the appellate court making the argument initially about why she should get a trial. Can you break down for our viewers why you all are arguing she should get a new trial?
Sure, and thank you for having me here this morning, and thank you for your interest in this appeal. We've raised 4 different issues on appeal. The issue that we focused on for our oral argument had to do with the denial of the defense request for surrebuttal. And to just kind of break down what that means, the state did not call any expert witness in its case in chief that went to Sydney's mental state at the time. And this was a case where not guilty by reason of insanity was the only issue before the jury. The defense called 3 preeminent psychologists, all of which testified that Sydney met the legal test for not guilty by reason of insanity. And then when Dawn and the defense attempted to recall one of those experts to rebut some of the state's expert statements that were not previously disclosed, the court denied him the opportunity to do that. We feel that that is a very strong appellate issue because it goes to the fairness of the case. And also importantly, before trial, defense counsel, Dawn, asked the court for the opportunity to do just that, to rebut the opinions of the state's experts, especially those that were not previously disclosed, if any. That's kind of what the thought was. And the court just blanketly denied the opportunity to do it even before trial, which really gave the state the green light to have not only the last word on the issue of whether Sydney was not guilty by reason of insanity, but also the state had the opportunity to essentially know that whatever the expert was going to testify to would not ultimately be challenged by a defense expert. And that's particularly troubling, whereas what we had here, many of the opinions offered by the state's expert were not previously disclosed before the start of trial, as is required in Ohio.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. I haven't heard the term surrebuttal often in trials. And Dawn, we watched you zealously represent Sydney. We know you're a friend of Court TV, but watching you in action was just special to us to be able to see you go through this process with her. And this seemed to come down to a battle of the experts. There was a question of whether or not this was undiagnosed schizophrenia, whether or not it impacted her at that time, whether she was malingering. Can you talk about just the challenge at that point, at the end of the trial, and how you then had to communicate that not only with Sydney, but also her family?
Absolutely, Julia. And you're absolutely right. This was a case about mental health. It was a case about insanity. This wasn't a whodunit. The government and the defense all agreed that this was going to be a battle of the experts. And as Dan says, the problem is the state's only expert that they put up did no testing of Sydney. She claimed that Sydney Powell was malingering, but she didn't perform the accepted test to find out if she actually was malingering. So our 3 experts performed the tests and said those tests showed that Sydney was telling the truth, that she wasn't exaggerating. And it's important to note also, Julia, Sydney had been treated for these serious mental health issues for 3.5 years prior to the trial. She was diagnosed in the jail with serious mental health issues. She was in a psychiatric hospital before she was released on bond for serious mental health issues. So as Dan said, when the state got up there and put their expert on and said, you don't need to test to determine if someone is seriously mentally ill. I looked at her posts on social media. The state's expert said, I looked at her telephone text messages, and because of that, I knew she wasn't seriously mentally ill. Well, that's ridiculous. It's absurd. And our experts, if given the opportunity, would have completely rebutted that and said that that's not good science. But we were denied that opportunity, and that's why we believe we did not get a fair trial.
I do want to listen back, help our viewers understand what was going on at the time during that trial. Listen to the state's expert, the clinical psychologist, Sylvia Obradovich, and what she said about Sydney's condition.
That why you believe, or why it's your opinion that Ms. Powell knew the wrongfulness of her actions?
Absolutely. So when we're trying to determine somebody's knowledge of wrongfulness, there's some classic things that we're paying attention to. That would be lying. The second would be doing things to kind of conceal your actions or try to avoid detection. Could be fleeing the scene. In this case, she didn't have enough time to do that, so we're not faced with that. But then the other thing would also be so lying, concealing, avoiding detection, fleeing, and trying to implicate another perpetrator. Those would be some clear signs that somebody understands what they're doing is wrong.
So, Daniel, what's the status now? The argument in front of this court is that there should have been another expert being able to be called, and that was denied at trial. What happens now in this appeal, and are there other issues that may be argued in front of the court?
Sure. So the case has been fully briefed and it has been argued. So the only thing left to happen in this Court of Appeals case is for the court to rule. In addition to that issue, we also raised a few other issues. Number one, that the jury's verdict was against the manifest weight of the evidence. We argued that there were improper statements made by the state in its closing argument. And then we also argued that there were really unnecessary and prejudicial photos and testimony as to the cause and manner of death, which was not in dispute. So those issues are also pending in addition to the SIR rebuttal issue. And I want to respond just to one thing in the clip with Dr. Obradovich, where she mentioned, these attempts to conceal, and mentioned that Sydney didn't have enough time to flee. I mean, that's simply not what the evidence shows. And in fact, the defense experts testified that this so-called cover-up, which was, just so we're clear, Sydney, answering the phone and allegedly saying this is Brenda, and then running around the back of the house and throwing a frying pan through a window. I mean, she was alone with her mother's body for 26 minutes. She had her car in the driveway. She could have left. She made no effort to clean up, no effort to hide the weapons. This so-called cover-up was so bumbling and so absurd that, in the defense experts' view, it actually was consistent with mental illness and consistent with the fact that she was in a state of complete psychosis. So, and that is another argument that we put before the court. But to answer your question, we are waiting on an opinion. We can expect that typically 60 to 90 days, but it may be, that timeline may be a little bit longer given the complexity of the trial and the issues before the court. And at that point, like you said, we are asking that the court vacate the conviction and grant us a new trial and the opportunity to have a fair trial.
All right. Don, let me ask you this, because what made this case unique is that Sydney's family, Brenda's family, wanted this prosecution to not be this way, perhaps a misdemeanor or something where she wouldn't serve time. I remember a poignant moment during the trial, during the closing arguments, when you said you were guided by the statement of "please help us, Brenda," the mother, the victim in this case. How is Sydney doing now, and how are her family members doing?
You know, the Powell family is one of the strongest families I've ever met. And honestly, Julia, they've taught me a lot about being a father. They love Sydney, they love Brenda, and they know more than anyone on the planet what Brenda's wishes were. They know that Brenda, and they believe that this was a result of serious mental illness. They are standing by Sydney. They were present, as you said, throughout all of the trial. They were present at the oral argument for the appeal. They remain in constant contact with Sydney. And, you know, I'm really proud of Sydney. She's doing as well as could be expected. She's teaching other inmates at Marion Correctional Institute in Ohio, GED classes. She's enrolled in classes at The Ohio State University virtually to work on a degree. So Sydney is doing as well as she possibly could, but the family's wishes were really ignored by the Summit County Prosecutor's Office, ignored, and not only ignored, but completely disregarded. And that trial was torture. It was absolute torture for this family. And the idea that we might have to go through this again is really difficult, but it's the only hope for anything that would reasonably accomplish what Brenda wants, which is her family reunited.
Don, thank you for sharing that with us. I know this case just captivated so many of our viewers' attentions because it was such a difficult case. I wish I could talk to you all about this much longer, but we do have to get to a break. But Don and Dan, thank you so much for joining us this morning and sharing us this information about Sydney Powell's case.